Aspects of Faith. 10. Christianity and Culture. This collection of 3 articles was Lewis's part in a series of 5 papers first published in Theology, volumes 40 and 41, March-December 1940. It is now in Christian Reflections, 1998. The other writers were S. L. Bethel and E. F. Carrett, Replies to Mr. Lewis, and George Every, In Defense of Criticism. If the heavenly life is not grown up in you, it signifies nothing what you have chosen in the stead of it, or why you have chosen it. William Law. 1. At an early age I came to believe that the life of culture, that is, of intellectual and aesthetic activity, was very good for its own sake, or even that it was good for man. After my conversion, which occurred in my later 20s, I continued to hold this belief without consciously asking how it could be reconciled with my new belief that the end of human life was salvation in Christ and the glorifying of God. I was awakened from this confused state of mind by finding that the friends of culture seemed to me to be exaggerating. In my reaction against what seemed exaggerated, I was driven to the other extreme, and began, in my own mind, to belittle the claims of culture. As soon as I did this, I was faced with the question, if it is a thing of so little value, how are you justified in spending so much of your life on it? The present inordinate esteem of culture by the cultured began, I think, with Matthew Arnold. At least, if I am right in supposing that he first popularized the use of the English word spiritual in the sense of German geistlich. This was nothing less than the identification of levels of life hitherto usually distinguished. After Arnold came the vogue of Croce, in whose philosophy the aesthetic and logical activities were made autonomous forms of the spirit, coordinate with the ethical. There followed the poetics of Dr. I. A. Richards. This great atheist critic found in a good poetical taste the means of attaining psychological adjustments which improved a man's power of effective and satisfactory living all round, while bad taste resulted in a corresponding loss. Since this theory of value was a purely psychological one, this amounted to giving poetry a kind of soteriological function. It held the keys of the only heaven that Dr. Richards believed in. His work, which I respect profoundly, was continued, though not always in directions he accepted, by the editors of Scrutiny, who believed in a necessary relationship between the quality of the individual's response to art and his general fitness for humane living. Finally, as might have been expected, a somewhat similar view was expressed by a Christian writer, in fact by Brother Every in Theology for March 1939. In an article entitled The Necessity of Scrutiny, Brother Every inquired what Mr. Eliot's admirers were to think of a church where those who seemed to be theologically equipped preferred Houseman, Mr. Charles Morgan, and Miss Sayers to Lawrence, Joyce, and Mr. E. M. Forster. He spoke, I think with sympathy, of the sensitive questioning individual who is puzzled at finding the same judgments made by Christians as by other conventional people. And he talked of testing theological students as regards their power to evaluate a new piece of writing on a secular subject. As soon as I read this, there was the devil to pay. I was not sure that I understood, I am still not sure that I understand, Brother Every's position. But I felt that some readers might easily get the notion that sensitivity or good taste were among the notes of the true church, or that coarse, unimaginative people were less likely to be saved than refined and poetic people. In the heat of the moment, I rushed to the opposite extreme. I felt, with some spiritual pride, that I had been saved in the nick of time from being sensitive. The sentimentality and cheapness of much Christian hymnody had been a strong point in my own resistance to conversion. Now I felt almost thankful for the bad hymns. It was good that we should have to lay down our precious refinement at the very doorstep of the church. Good that we should be cured at the outset of our inveterate confusion between psyche and pneuma, nature and supernature. A man is never so proud as when striking an attitude of humility. Brother Every will not suspect me of being still in the condition I describe, nor of still attributing to him the preposterous beliefs I have just suggested. But there remains, none the less, a real problem which his article forced upon me in its most acute form. No one, presumably, is really maintaining that a fine taste in the arts is a condition of salvation. Yet the glory of God, and, as our only means to glorifying Him, the salvation of human souls, is the real business of life. What then is the value of culture? It is, of course, no new question, but as a living question it was new to me. I naturally turned first to the New Testament. Here I found, in the first place, a demand that whatever is most highly valued on the natural level is to be held, as it were, merely on sufferance, and to be abandoned without mercy the moment it conflicts with the service of God. The organs of sense, Matthew chapter 5, verse 29, and of virility, Matthew chapter 19, verse 12, may have to be sacrificed. And I took it that the least these words could mean was that a life, by natural standards, crippled and thwarted, was not only no bar to salvation, but might easily be one of its conditions. The text about hating father and mother, Luke chapter 14, verse 26, and our Lord's apparent belittling even of his own natural relation to the Blessed Virgin, Matthew chapter 12, verse 48, were even more discouraging. I took it for granted that anyone in his senses would hold it better to be a good son than a good critic, and that whatever was said of natural affection was implied a fortiori of culture. The worst of all was Philippians chapter 3, verse 8, where something obviously more relevant to spiritual life than culture can be, blameless conformity to the Jewish law, was described as muck. In the second place, I found a number of emphatic warnings against every kind of superiority. We were told to become as children, Matthew chapter 18, verse 3, not to be called rabbi, Matthew chapter 23, verse 8, to dread reputation, Luke chapter 6, verse 26. We were reminded that few of the sophoi kata savka, which I suppose means precisely the intelligentsia, are called. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26. That a man must become a fool by secular standards before he can attain real wisdom. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. Against all this, I found some passages that could be interpreted in a sense more favourable to culture. I argued that secular learning might be embodied in the Magi, that the talents in the parable might conceivably include talents in the modern sense of the word, that the miracle at Cana in Galilee, by sanctifying an innocent sensuous pleasure, could be taken to sanctify at least a recreational use of culture, mere entertainment, and that aesthetic enjoyment of nature was certainly hallowed by our Lord's praise of the lilies. At least some use of science was implied in St. Paul's demand that we should perceive the invisible through the visible, Romans chapter 1, verse 20. But I was more than doubtful whether his exhortation, "Be not children in mind," 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 20, and his boast of wisdom among the initiate, referred to anything that we should recognize as secular culture. On the whole, the New Testament seemed, if not hostile, yet unmistakably cold to culture. I think we can still believe culture to be innocent after we have read the New Testament. I cannot see that we are encouraged to think it important. It might be important none the less, for Hooker has finally answered the contention that Scripture must contain everything important or even everything necessary. Remembering this, I continued my researches. If my selection of authorities seems arbitrary, that is due not to a bias, but to my ignorance. I used such authors as I happened to know. Of the great pagans, Aristotle is on our side. Plato will tolerate no culture that does not directly or indirectly conduce either to the intellectual vision of the good or the military efficiency of the Commonwealth. Joyce and D.H. Lawrence would have fared ill in the Republic. The Buddha was, I believe, anti-cultural, but here especially I speak under correction. St. Augustine regarded the liberal education which he had undergone in his boyhood as a dementia, and wondered why it should be considered honestio et uberio than the really useful primary education which preceded it. Confessions 1:13. He is extremely distrustful of his own delight in church music. Confessions 10:33. A tragedy, which for Dr. Richards is a great exercise of the spirit, is for St. Augustine a kind of sore. The spectator suffers, yet loves his suffering, and this is a miserabilis insania. Quid autum mirum cum in felix pecus, aberrans aggrege tuo et impatiens custodiae tuae turpis gabiae foedera. Confessions 3:2. St. Jerome, allegorizing the parable of the prodigal son, suggests that the husks with which he was fain to fill his belly may signify cibus daemonum. Carmina poeterum, secularis sapientia, rhetoricorum pompa verborum. Epistle 21:4. Let none reply that the Fathers were speaking of polytheistic literature at a time when polytheism was still a danger. The scheme of values presupposed in most imaginative literature has not become very much more Christian since the time of St. Jerome. In Hamlet we see everything questioned except the duty of revenge. In all Shakespeare's works, the conception of good really operative, whatever the characters may say, seems to be purely worldly. In medieval romance, honour and sexual love are the true values. In 19th century fiction, sexual love and material prosperity. In romantic poetry, either the enjoyment of nature, ranging from pantheistic mysticism at one end of the scale to mere innocent sensuousness at the other, or else the indulgence of a Sehnsucht, awakened by the past, the distant and the imagined but not believed supernatural. In modern literature, the life of liberated instinct. There are, of course, exceptions, but to study these exceptions would not be to study literature as such, and as a whole. All literatures, as Newman has said, are one. They are the voices of the natural man. If literature is to be made a study of human nature, you cannot have a Christian literature. It is a contradiction in terms to attempt a sinless literature of sinful man. And I could not doubt that the sub-Christian or anti-Christian values implicit in most literature did actually infect many readers. Only a few days ago I was watching, in some scholarship papers, the results of this infection, in a belief that the crimes of such Shakespearean characters as Cleopatra and Macbeth were somehow compensated for by a quality described as their greatness. This very morning I have read in a critic the remark that if the wicked lovers in Webster's White Devil had repented, we should hardly have forgiven them. And many people certainly draw from Keats's phrase about negative capability, or love of good and evil, if the reading which attributes to him such meaningless words is correct, a strange doctrine that experience simpliciter is good. I do not say that the sympathetic reading of literature must produce such results, but that it may, and often does. If we are to answer the Fathers' attack on pagan literature, we must not ground our answer on a belief that literature as a whole has become, in any important sense, more Christian since their days. In Thomas Aquinas I could not find anything directly bearing on my problem, but I am very poor Thomist, and shall be grateful for correction on this point. Thomas à Kempis I take to be definitely on the anti-cultural side. In the Theologia Germanica, chapter 20, I found that nature's refusal of the life of Christ happeneth most of all where there are high natural gifts of reason, for that soareth upwards in its own light and by its own power, till at last it cometh to think itself the true eternal light. But in a later chapter, 42, I found the evil of the false light identified with its tendency to love knowledge and discernment more than the object known and discerned. This seemed to point to the possibility of a knowledge which avoided that error. The cumulative effect of all this was very discouraging to culture. On the other side, perhaps only through the accidental distribution of my ignorance, I found much less. I found the famous saying, attributed to Gregory, that our use of secular culture was comparable to the action of the Israelites in going down to the Philistines to have their knives sharpened. This seems to me a most satisfactory argument as far as it goes, and very relevant to modern conditions. If we are to convert our heathen neighbours, we must understand their culture. We must beat them at their own game. But of course, while this would justify Christian culture, at least for some Christians whose vocation lay in that direction at the moment, it would come very far short of the claims made for culture in our modern tradition. On the Gregorian view, culture is a weapon, and a weapon is essentially a thing we lay aside as soon as we safely can. In Milton I found a disquieting ally. His Areopagitica troubled me just as Brother Every's article had troubled me. He seemed to make too little of the difficulties, and his glorious defence of freedom to explore all good and evil seemed, after all, to be based on an aristocratic preoccupation with great souls and a contemptuous indifference to the mass of mankind, which, I suppose, no Christian can tolerate. Finally, I came to that book of Newman's from which I have already quoted, the Lectures on University Education. Here, at last, I found an author who seemed to be aware of both sides of the question. For no one ever insisted so eloquently as Newman on the beauty of culture for its own sake, and no one ever so sternly resisted the temptation to confuse it with things spiritual. The cultivation of the intellect, according to him, is for this world. Between it and genuine religion there is a radical difference. It makes not the Christian, but the gentleman, and looks like virtue only at a distance. He will not for an instant allow that it makes men better. The pastors of the Church may indeed welcome culture because it provides innocent distraction at those moments of spiritual relaxation which would otherwise very likely lead to sin. And in this way it often draws the mind off from things which will harm it to subjects worthy of a rational being. But even in so doing, it does not raise it above nature, nor has any tendency to make us pleasing to our Maker. In some instances, the cultural and the spiritual value of an activity may even be in inverse ratio. Theology, when it ceases to be part of liberal knowledge and is pursued for purely pastoral ends, gains in meritoriousness, but loses in liberality, just as a face worn by tears and fasting loses its beauty. On the other hand, Newman is certain that liberal knowledge is an end in itself. The whole of the fourth discourse is devoted to this theme. The solution of this apparent antinomy lies in his doctrine that everything, including, of course, the intellect, has its own perfection. Things animate, inanimate, visible, invisible, all are good in their kind and have a best of themselves, which is an object of pursuit. To perfect the mind is an object as intelligible as the cultivation of virtue, while, at the same time, it is absolutely distinct from it. Whether because I am too poor a theologian to understand the implied doctrine of grace and nature, or for some other reason, I have not been able to make Newman's conclusion my own. I can well understand that there is a kind of goodness which is not moral, as a well-grown healthy toad is better or more perfect than a three-legged toad, or an archangel is better than an angel. In this sense, a clever man is better than a dull one, or any man than a chimpanzee. The trouble comes when we start asking how much of our time and energy God wants us to spend in becoming better or more perfect in this sense. If Newman is right in saying that culture has no tendency to make us pleasing to our Maker, then the answer would seem to be none. And that is a tenable view, as though God said, "Your natural degree of perfection, your place in the chain of being, is my affair. Do you get on with what I have explicitly left as your task, righteousness?" But if Newman had thought this, he would not, I suppose, have written the discourse on liberal knowledge its own end. On the other hand, it would be possible to hold, perhaps it is pretty generally held, that one of the moral duties of a rational creature was to attain to the highest non-moral perfection it could. But if this were so, then a. the perfecting of the mind would not be absolutely distinct from virtue, but part of the content of virtue, and b. it would be very odd that Scripture and the tradition of the Church have little or nothing to say about this duty. I am afraid that Newman has left the problem very much where he found it. He has clarified our minds by explaining that culture gives us a non-moral perfection. But on the real problem, that of relating such non-moral values to the duty or interest of creatures who are every minute advancing either to heaven or hell, he seems to help little. Sensitivity may be a perfection, But if by becoming sensitive I neither please God nor save my soul, why should I become sensitive? Indeed, what exactly is meant by a perfection compatible with utter loss of the end for which I was created? My researches left me with the impression that there could be no question of restoring to culture the kind of status which I had given it before my conversion. If any constructive case for culture was to be built up, it would have to be of a much humbler kind. And the whole tradition of educated infidelity, from Arnold to Scrutiny, appeared to me as but one phase in that general rebellion against God which began in the 18th century. In this mood I set about construction. 1. I begin at the lowest and least ambitious level. My own professional work, though conditioned by taste and talents, is immediately motivated by the need for earning my living. And on earning one's living, I was relieved to note that Christianity, in spite of its revolutionary and apocalyptic elements, can be delightfully humdrum. The Baptists did not give the tax-gatherers and soldiers lectures on the immediate necessity of turning the economic and military system of the ancient world upside down. He told them to obey the moral law, as they had presumably learned it from their mothers and nurses, and sent them back to their jobs. St. Paul advised the Thessalonians to stick to their work, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 11, and not to become busybodies, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 11. The need for money is therefore simpliciter and innocent, though by no means a splendid motive for any occupation. The Ephesians are warned to work professionally at something that is good, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. I hope that good here did not mean much more than harmless, and I was certain it did not imply anything very elevated. Provided, then, that there was a demand for culture, and that culture was not actually deleterious, I concluded I was justified in making my living by supplying that demand, and that all others in my position, dons, schoolmasters, professional authors, critics, reviewers, were similarly justified, especially if, like me, they had few or no talents for any other career. If their vocation to a cultural profession consisted in the brute fact of not being fit for anything else. 2. But is culture even harmless? It certainly can be harmful, and often is. If a Christian found himself in the position of one inaugurating a new society in vacuo, he might well decide not to introduce something whose abuse is so easy and whose use is, at any rate, not necessary. But that is not our position. The abuse of culture is already there, and will continue whether Christians cease to be cultured or not. It is therefore probably better that the ranks of the culture sellers should include some Christians, as an antidote. It may even be the duty of some Christians to be culture sellers. And not that I have yet said anything to show that even the lawful use of culture stands very high. The lawful use might be no more than innocent pleasure, but if the abuse is common, the task of resisting that abuse might be not only lawful, but obligatory. Thus, people in my position might be said to be working the thing which is good, in a stronger sense than that reached in the last paragraph. In order to avoid misunderstanding, I must add that when I speak of resisting the abuse of culture, I do not mean that a Christian should take money for supplying one thing, culture, and use the opportunity thus gained to supply a quite different thing, homiletics and apologetics, that is, stealing. The mere presence of Christians in the ranks of the culture sellers will inevitably provide an antidote. It will be seen that I have now reached something very like the Gregorian view of culture as a weapon. Can I now go a step further and find any intrinsic goodness in culture for its own sake? 3. When I ask what culture has done to me personally, the most obviously true answer is that it has given me quite an enormous amount of pleasure. I have no doubt at all that pleasure is in itself a good, and pain in itself an evil. If not, then the whole Christian tradition about heaven and hell and the passion of our Lord seems to have no meaning. Pleasure, then, is good. A sinful pleasure means a good offered and accepted under conditions which involve a breach of the moral law. The pleasures of culture are not intrinsically bound up with such conditions, though of course they can very easily be so enjoyed as to involve them. Often, as Newman saw, They are an excellent diversion from guilty pleasures. We may therefore enjoy them ourselves, and lawfully, even charitably, teach others to enjoy them. This view gives us some ease, though it would go a very little way towards satisfying the editors of Scrutiny. We should indeed be justified in propagating good taste on the ground that cultured pleasure in the arts is more varied, intense, and lasting than vulgar or popular pleasure. But we should not regard it as meritorious. In fact, much as we should differ from Bentham about value in general, we should have to be Benthamites on the issue between pushpin and poetry. 4. It was noticed above that the values assumed in literature were seldom those of Christianity. Some of the principal values actually implicit in European literature were described as A. Honour, B. Sexual love, C. Material prosperity, D. Pantheistic contemplation of nature, E. Sehnsucht, awakened by the past, the remote, or the imagined supernatural, F. Liberation of impulses. These were called sub-Christian. This is a term of disapproval if we are comparing them with Christian values. But if we take sub-Christian to mean immediately sub-Christian, i.e., the highest level of merely natural value lying immediately below the lowest level of spiritual value, it may be a term of relative approval. Some of the 6 values I have enumerated may be sub-Christian in this relatively good sense. For C and F I can make no defence. Whenever they are accepted by the reader with anything more than a willing suspension of disbelief, they must make him worse. But the other 4 are all two-edged. I may symbolize what I think of them all by the aphorism, "Any road out of Jerusalem must also be a road into Jerusalem." Thus, A. To the perfected Christian, the ideal of honour is simply a temptation. His courage has a better root, and, being learned in Gethsemane, may have no honour about it. But to the man coming up from below, the ideal of knighthood may prove a schoolmaster to the ideal of martyrdom. Galahad is the son of Lancelot. B. The road described by Dante and Patmore is a dangerous one. But mere animalism, however disguised as honesty, frankness, or the like, is not dangerous, but fatal. And not all are qualified to be, even in sentiment, eunuchs for the kingdom's sake. For some souls, romantic love also has proved a schoolmaster. D. There is any easy transition from theism to pantheism, but there is also a blessed transition in the other direction. For some souls, I believe, for my own, I remember, Wordsworthian contemplation can be the first and lowest form of recognition that there is something outside ourselves which demands reverence. To return to pantheistic errors about the nature of this something would, for a Christian, be very bad. But once again, for the man coming up from below, the Wordsworthian experience is an advance. Even if he goes no further, he has escaped the worst arrogance of materialism. If he goes on, he will be converted. E. The dangers of romantic Sehnsucht are very great. Eroticism and even occultism lie in wait for it. On this subject, I can only give my own experience for what it is worth. When we are first converted, I suppose we think mostly of our recent sins, but as we go on, more and more of the terrible past comes under review. In this process, I have not, or not yet, reached a point at which I can honestly repent of my earlier experiences of romantic Sehnsucht. That they were occasions to much that I do repent is clear. But I still cannot help thinking that this was my abuse of them, and that the experiences themselves contained from the very first a wholly good element. Without them, my conversion would have been more difficult. I have dwelt chiefly on certain kinds of literature, not because I think them the only elements in culture that have this value as schoolmasters, but because I know them best, and on literature rather than art and knowledge for the same reason. My general case may be stated in Richardian terms, that culture is a storehouse of the best sub-Christian values. These values are in themselves of the soul, not the spirit. But God created the soul. Its values may be expected, therefore, to contain some reflection or antepast of the spiritual values. They will save no man, They resemble the regenerate life only as affection resembles charity, or honour resembles virtue, or the moon the sun. But though like is not the same, it is better than unlike. Imitation may pass into initiation. For some it is a good beginning, for others it is not. Culture is not everyone's road into Jerusalem, and for some it is a road out. There is another way in which it may predispose to conversion. The difficulty of converting an uneducated man nowadays lies in his complacency. Popularized science, the conventions or unconventions of his immediate circle, party programs, etc., enclose him in a tiny windowless universe which he mistakes for the only possible universe. There are no distant horizons, no mysteries. He thinks everything has been settled. A cultured person, on the other hand, is almost compelled to be aware that reality is very odd, and that the ultimate truth, whatever it may be, must have the characteristics of strangeness, must be something that would seem remote and fantastic to the uncultured. Thus some obstacles to faith have been removed already. On these grounds, I conclude that culture has a distinct part to play in bringing certain souls to Christ. Not all souls. There is a shorter and safer way which has always been followed by thousands of simple affectional natures who begin, where we hope to end, with devotion to the person of Christ. Has it any part to play in the life of the converted? I think so, and in two ways. A. If all the cultural values on the way up to Christianity were dim antipasts and ectypes of the truth, we can recognize them as such still. And since we must rest and play, where can we do so better than here, in the suburbs of Jerusalem? It is lawful to rest our eyes in moonlight, especially now that we know where it comes from, that it is only sunlight at second hand. B. Whether the purely contemplative life is or is not desirable for any, it is certainly not the vocation of all. Most men must glorify God by doing to his glory something which is not per se an act of glorifying, but which becomes so by being offered. If, as I now hope, cultural activities are innocent and even useful, then they also, like the sweeping of the room in Herbert's poem, can be done to the Lord. The work of a charwoman and the work of a poet become spiritual in the same way and on the same condition. There must be no return to the Arnoldian or Richardian view. Let us stop giving ourselves airs. If it is argued that the sensitivity which Brother Every desires is something different from my culture or good taste, I must reply that I have chosen those words as the most general terms for something which is differently conceived in every age. Wit, correctness, imagination, and now sensitivity. These names, of course, record real changes of opinion about it. But if it were contended that the latest conception is so different from all its predecessors that we now have a radically new situation, that while wit was not necessary for a 7th-century Christian, sensitivity is necessary for a 20th-century Christian, I should find this very hard to believe. Sensitivity is a potentiality, therefore neutral. It can no more be an end to Christians than experience. If Philippians chapter 1 verse 9 is quoted against me, I reply that delicate discriminations are there traced to charity, not to critical experience of books. Every virtue is a habitus, i.e., a good stock response. And Dr. Richards very candidly recognizes this when he speaks of people hag-ridden by their vices or their virtues, italics mine. But we want to be so ridden. I do not want a sensitivity which will show me how different each temptation to lust or cowardice is from the last, how unique, how unamenable to general rules. A stock response is precisely what I need to acquire. Moral theologians, I believe, tell us to fly at sight from temptations to faith or chastity. If that is not, in Dr. Richards's words, a stock, stereotyped, conventional response, I do not know what is. In fact, the new ideal of sensitivity seems to me to present culture to Christians in a somewhat less favourable light than its predecessors. Sidney's poetics would be better. The whole school of critical thought which descends from Dr. Richards bears such deep marks of its anti-Christian origins that I question if it can ever be baptized. 2. To the Editor of Theology. Sir, Mr. Bethel's main position is so important that I hope you will allow me at some future date to deal with it in a full-length argument. For the moment, therefore, I will only say, 1. That I made no reference to his previous paper for the worst of reasons and the best of causes, namely, that I had forgotten it. For this negligence I ask his pardon. On looking back at the relevant number of Theology, I see from marginalia in my own hand that I must have read his contribution with great interest. For my forgetfulness, I can only plead that a great many things have happened to us all since then. I am distressed that Mr. Bethel should suppose himself deliberately slighted. I intended no disrespect to him. 2. That my position logically implies total depravity, I deny simply. How any logician could derive the proposition human nature is totally depraved from the proposition cultural activities do not in themselves improve our spiritual condition, I cannot understand. Even if I had said, which I did not, man's aesthetic nature is totally depraved, no one could infer man's whole nature is totally depraved without a glaring transference from secundum quid to simpliciter. I put it to Mr. Bethel that he has used logically implies to mean may without gross uncharity rouse the suspicion of, and that he ought not to use words that way. To Mr. Carrett I reply that my argument assumed the divinity of Christ, the truth of the creeds, and the authority of the Christian tradition, because I was writing in an Anglican periodical. That is why Dominical and patristic sayings have for me more than an antiquarian interest. But though my attribution of authority to Christ or the Fathers may depend on premises which Mr. Carrett does not accept, my belief that it is proper to combine my own reasonings with the witness of authority has a different ground, prior to any decision on the question, who is authoritative? One of the things my reason tells me is that I ought to check the results of my own thinking by the opinions of the wise. I go to authority because reason sends me to it, just as Mr. Carrett, after adding up a column of figures, might ask a friend, known to be a good calculator, to check it for him, and might distrust his own result if his friend got a different one. I said that culture was a storehouse of the best sub-Christian values, not the best sub-Christian virtues. I meant by this that culture recorded man striving for those ends which, though not the true end of man, the fruition of God, have nevertheless some degree of similarity to it, and are not so grossly inadequate to the nature of man as, say, physical pleasure or money. This similarity, of course, while making it less evil to rest in them, makes the danger of resting in them greater and more subtle. The salvation of souls is a means to the glorifying of God, because only saved souls can duly glorify him. The thing to which, on my view, culture must be subordinated is not, though it includes, moral virtue, but the conscious direction of all will and desire to a transcendental person in whom I believe all values to reside, and the reference to him in every thought and act. Since that person loves righteousness, this total surrender to him involves Mr. Carrett's conscientiousness. It would therefore be impossible to glorify God by doing what we thought wrong. Doing what we think right, on the other hand, is not the same as glorifying God. I fully agree with Mr. Carrett that, a priori, we might expect the production of whatever is good to be one of our duties. If God had never spoken to man, we should be justified in basing the conduct of life wholly on such a priori grounds. Those who think God has spoken will naturally listen to what he has to say about the where, how, to what extent, and in what spirit any good is to be pursued. This does not mean that our own conscience is simply negated. On the contrary, just as reason sends me to authority, so conscience sends me to obedience. For one of the things my conscience tells me is that if there exists an absolutely wise and good person, Aristotle's Phronimos raised to the 9th, I owe him obedience, especially when that person, as the ground of my existence, has a kind of paternal claim on me, and, as a benefactor, has a claim on my gratitude. What would happen if there were an absolute clash between God's will and my own conscience, i.e., if either God could be bad or I were an incurable moral idiot, I naturally do not know, any more than Mr. Carrot knows what would happen if he found absolutely demonstrative evidence for two contradictory propositions. I mentioned Hooker not because he simply denied that Scripture contains all things necessary, but because he advanced a proof that it cannot, which proof, I supposed, most readers of theology would remember. Text hunting is, of course, puritanical, but also scholastic, patristic, apostolic, and dominical. To that kind of charge I venture, presuming on an indulgence which Mr. Carrot has extended to me for nearly 20 years, to reply with homely saws. As that an old trout can't be caught by tickling, and they know a trick worth two of that where I come from. Puritan, quotha. Yours faithfully, C.S. Lewis. 3. Peace proposals for Brother Every and Mr. Bethel. I believe there is little real disagreement between my critics, Brother Every and Mr. Bethel, and myself. Mr. Carrot, who does not accept the Christian premises, must here be left out of account, though with all the respect and affection I feel for my old tutor and friend. The conclusion I reached in theology, March 1940, was that culture, though not in itself meritorious, was innocent and pleasant, might be a vocation for some, was helpful in bringing certain souls to Christ, and could be pursued to the glory of God. I do not see that Brother Every and Mr. Bethel really want me to go beyond this position. The argument of Mr. Bethel's paper in Theology, July 1939, excluding its historical section, which does not here concern us, was that the deepest and often unconscious beliefs of a writer were implicit in his work, even in what might seem the minor details of its style, and that, unless we were Croceans, such beliefs must be taken into account in estimating the value of that work. In Theology, May 1940, Mr. Bethel reaffirmed this doctrine, with the addition that the latent beliefs in much modern fiction were naturalistic, and that we needed trained critics to put Christian readers on their guard against this pervasive influence. Brother Every, in Theology, September 1940, maintained that our tastes are symptomatic of our real standards of value, which may differ from our professed standards, and that we needed trained critics to show us the real latent standards in literature, in fact, to teach us how to read. I cannot see that my own doctrine and those of my critics come into direct contradiction at any point. My fear was lest excellence in reading and writing were being elevated into a spiritual value, into something meritorious per se, just as other things excellent and wholesome in themselves, like conjugal love, in the sense of eros, or physical cleanliness, have at some times and in some circles been confused with virtue itself, or esteemed necessary parts of it. But it now appears that my critics never intended to make any such claim. A bad taste for them is not itself spiritual evil, but the symptom which betrays, or the carrier which circulates, spiritual evil. And the spiritual evil thus betrayed or carried turns out not to be any specifically cultural or literary kind of evil, but false beliefs or standards, that is, intellectual error or moral baseness. And as I never intended to deny that error and baseness were evils, nor that literature could imply and carry them, I think that all three of us may shake hands and say we are agreed. I do not mean to suggest that my critics have merely restated a platitude which neither I nor anyone else ever disputed. The value of their contribution lies in their assistance that the real beliefs may differ from the professed, and may lurk in the turn of a phrase or the choice of an epithet, with the result that many preferences which seem to the ignorant to be simply matters of taste are visible to the trained critic as choices between good and evil, or truth and error. And I fully admit that this important point had been neglected in my essay of March 1940. And now that it has been made, I heartily accept it. I think this is agreement. But to test the depth of agreement, I would like my critics to consider the following positions. By agreement, I mean only agreement in our doctrines. Differences of temper and emphasis between Christian critics are inevitable and probably desirable. 1. Is it the function of the trained critic to discover the latent beliefs and standards in a book, or to pass judgment on them when discovered, or both? I think Brother Every confines the critic's function to discovery. About Mr. Bethel I am not so sure. When he says, Theology, May 1940, page 360, that we need a minority of trained critics to lay bare the false values of contemporary culture, this might mean two things. A. To expose the falsity of the values of contemporary culture. B. To reveal what the values of contemporary culture actually are, and by the way I personally think those values false. It is necessary to clear this up before we know what is meant by a trained critic. Trained in what? A man who has had a literary training may be an expert in disengaging the beliefs and values latent in literature. But the judgment on those beliefs and values, that is, the judgment on all possible human thoughts and moralities, belongs either to a quite different set of experts, theologians, philosophers, casuists, scientists, or else not to experts at all, but to the unspecialized, good and wise man, the Frominos. Now I, for my part, have no objection to our doing both when we criticize, but I think it very important to keep the two operations distinct. In the discovery of the latent belief, we have had a special training and speak as experts. In the judgment of the beliefs, once they have been discovered, we humbly hope that we are being trained, like everyone else, by reason and ripening experience, under the guidance of the Holy Ghost as long as we live. But we speak on them simply as men, on a level with all our even Christians, and indeed with less authority than any illiterate man who happens to be older, wiser, and purer than we. To transfer to these judgments any specialist authority which may belong to us as trained critics is charlatanism, if the attempt is conscious, and confusion if it is not. If Brother Every, see Theology, September 1940, page 161, condemns a book because of English liberal implications, he is really saying two things. A. This book has English liberal implications. B. English liberalism is an evil. The first he utters with authority because he is a trained critic. In the second he may be right or he may be wrong, but he speaks with no more authority than any other man. A failure to observe this distinction may turn literary criticism into a sort of stalking horse, from behind which a man may shoot all his personal opinions on any and every subject without ever really arguing in their defence, and under cover of a quite irrelevant specialist training in literature. I do not accuse Brother Every of this, but a glance at any modern review will show that it is an ever-present danger. 2. In Theology, May 1940, page 359, Mr. Bethel speaks of some form of biological or economic naturalism as the unconscious attitude in most popular fiction of today, and cites, as straws that show the wind, the popularity of urges and overmastering passions. Now, fortunately, I agree with Mr. Bethel in thinking naturalism an erroneous philosophy, and I am ready to grant, for the purposes of argument, that those who talk about urges do so because they are unconsciously naturalistic. But when all this has been granted, can we honestly say that the whole of our dislike of urges is explained, without remainder, by our disagreement with naturalism? Surely not. Surely we object to that way of writing for another reason as well, because it is so worn, so facile, so obviously attempting to be impressive, so associated in our minds with dullness and pomposity. In other words, there are two elements in our reaction. One is the detection of an attitude in the writer which, as instructed Christians and amateur philosophers, we disapprove. The other is really and strictly an affair of taste. Now these, again, require to be kept distinct. Being fallen creatures, we tend to resent offences against our taste at least as much as, or even more than, offences against our conscience or reason. And we would dearly like to be able, if only we can find any plausible argument for doing so, to inflict upon the man whose writing, perhaps for reasons utterly unconnected with good and evil, has afflicted us like a bad smell, the same kind of condemnation which we can inflict on him who has uttered the false and the evil. The tendency is easily observed among children. Friendship wavers when you discover that a hitherto trusted playmate actually likes prunes. But even for adults it is sweet, sweet, sweet poison to feel able to imply, "Thus saith the Lord," at the end of every expression of our pet aversions. To avoid this horrible danger, we must perpetually try to distinguish, however closely they get entwined both by the subtle nature of the facts and by the secret importunity of our passions, those attitudes in a writer which we can honestly and confidently condemn as real evils, and those qualities in his writing which simply annoy and offend us as men of taste. This is difficult, because the latter are often so much more obvious and provoke such a very violent response. The only safe course seems to me to be this: to reserve our condemnation of attitudes for attitudes universally acknowledged to be bad by the Christian conscience, speaking in agreement with Scripture and ecumenical tradition. A bad book is deemed to be a real evil in so far as it can be shown to prompt to sensuality, or pride, or murder, or to conflict with the doctrine of divine providence, or the like. The other dyslogistic terms dear to critics, vulgar, derivative, cheap, precious, academic, affected, bourgeois, Victorian, Georgian, literary, etc., had better be kept strictly on the taste side of the account. In discovering what attitudes are present you can be as subtle as you like. But in your theological and ethical condemnation, as distinct from your dislike of the taste, you had better be very unsubtle. You had better reserve it for plain mortal sins and plain atheism and heresy. For our passions are always urging us in the opposite direction, and if we are not careful, criticism may become a mere excuse for taking revenge on books whose smell we dislike, by erecting our temperamental antipathies into pseudo-moral judgments. 3. In practical life, a certain amount of reading between the lines is necessary. If we took every letter and every remark simply at its face value, we should soon find ourselves in difficulties. On the other hand, most of us have known people with whom reading between the lines became such a mania that they overlooked the obvious truth of every situation, and lived in the perpetual discovery of mares' nests. And doctors tell us of a form of lunacy in which the simplest remark uttered in the patient's presence becomes to him evidence of a conspiracy, and the very furniture of his cell takes on an infinitely sinister significance. Will my critics admit that the subtle and difficult task of digging out the latent beliefs and values, however necessary, is attended with some danger of our neglecting the obvious and surface facts about a book, whose importance, even if less than that of the latent facts, is certainly much higher than 0. Suppose two books, A and B. Suppose it can be truly said of A, "The very style of this book reveals great sensitivity and honesty, and a readiness for total commitments, excellent raw material for sanctity if ever the author were converted." And suppose it can be truly said of B, "The very style of this book betrays a woolly, uncompromising state of mind, knee-deep entangled in the materialistic values which the author thinks he has rejected." But might it not also be true to say of Book A, "Despite its excellent latent implications, its ostensible purpose, which will corrupt thousands of readers, is the continued glorification of mortal sin"; and of B, "Despite its dreadful latent materialism, it does set courage and fidelity before the reader in an attractive light, and thousands of readers will be edified, though much less edified than they suppose, by reading it." And is there not a danger of this second truth being neglected? We want the abstruse knowledge in addition to the obvious, not instead of it. 4. It is clear that the simple and ignorant are least able to resist, by reason, the influence of latent evil in the books they read. But is it not also true that this is often balanced by a kind of protection which comes to them through ignorance itself? I base this on 3 grounds. A. Adults often disquiet themselves about the effect of a work upon children. For example, the effect of the bad elements in Peter Pan, such as the desire not to grow up, or the sentimentalities about Wendy. But if I may trust my own memory, childhood simply does not receive these things. It rightly wants and enjoys the flying, the Indians, and the pirates, not to mention the pleasure of being in a theatre at all, and just accepts the rest of part of the meaningless roughage which occurs in all books and plays. For at that age we never expect any work of art to be interesting all through. When I began writing stories in exercise books, I tried to put off all the things I really wanted to write about till at least the second page. I thought it wouldn't be like a real grown-up book if it became interesting at once. B. I often find expressions in my pupils' essays which seem to me to imply a great deal of latent error and evil. Now, since it would in any case be latent, one does not expect them to own up to it when challenged. But one does expect that a process of exploration would discover the mental atmosphere to which the expression belonged. But in my experience, exploration often produces a conviction that it had, in my pupils' minds, no evil associations, because it had no associations at all. They just thought it was the ordinary way of translating thought into what they supposed to be literary English. Thousands of people are no more corrupted by the implications of urges, dynamism, and progressive than they are edified by the implications of secular, charity, and Platonic. The same process of attrition which empties good language of its virtue does, after all, empty bad language of much of its vice. C. If one speaks to an uneducated man about some of the worst features in a film or a book, does he not often reply unconcernedly, "Ah, they always got to bring a bit of that into a film," or "I reckon they put that in to wind it up like"? And does this not mean that he is aware, even to excess, of the difference between art and life? He expects a certain amount of meaningless nonsense, which expectation, though very regrettable from the cultural point of view, largely protects him from the consequences of which we, in our sophisticated naivety, are afraid. 5. Finally, I agree with Brother Every that our leisure, even our play, is a matter of serious concern. There is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second, is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan. But will Brother Every agree in acknowledging a real difficulty about merely recreational reading? I do not include all reading under this head, as about games. I mean that they are serious, and yet, to do them at all, we must somehow do them as if they were not. It is a serious matter to choose wholesome recreations, but they would no longer be recreations if we pursued them seriously. When Mr. Bethel speaks of the critic's working hours, May 1940, page 360, I hope he means his hours of criticism, not his hours of reading. For a great deal, not all, of our literature was made to be read lightly for entertainment. If we do not read it, in a sense, for fun, and with our feet on the fender, we are not using it as it was meant to be used, and all our criticism of it will be pure illusion. For you cannot judge any artifact except by using it as it was intended. It is no good judging a butter knife by seeing whether it will saw logs. Much bad criticism, indeed, results from the efforts of critics to get a work-time result out of something that never aimed at producing more than pleasure. There is a real problem here, and I do not see my way through it. But I should be disappointed if my critics denied the existence of the problem. If any real disagreement remains between us, I anticipate that it will be about my third point, about the distinction there drawn between the real spiritual evil carried or betrayed in a book and its mere faults of taste. And on this subject I confess that my critics can present me with a very puzzling dilemma. They can ask me whether the statement, "This is tawdry writing," is an objective statement describing something bad in a book and capable of being true or false, or whether it is merely a statement about the speaker's own feelings, different in form, but fundamentally the same as the proposition, "I don't like oysters." If I choose the latter, then most criticism becomes purely subjective, which I don't want. If I choose the former, then they can ask me, "What are these qualities in a book which you admit to be in some sense good and bad, but which, you keep on warning us, are not really or spiritually good and bad? Is there a kind of good which is not good? Is there any good that is not pleasing to God, or any bad which is not hateful to him? And if you press me along these lines, I end in doubts. But I will not get rid of those doubts by falsifying the little light I already have. That little light seems to compel me to say that there are two kinds of good and bad. The first, such as virtue and vice, or love and hatred, besides being good or bad themselves, make the possessor good or bad. The second do not. They include such things as physical beauty or ugliness, the possession or lack of a sense of humour, strength or weakness, pleasure or pain. But the two most relevant for us are the two I mentioned at the beginning of this essay. Conjugal eros, as distinct from agape, which of course is a good of the first class, and physical cleanliness. Surely we have all met people who said indeed that the latter was next to godliness, but whose unconscious attitude made it a part of godliness, and no small part. And surely we agree that any good of this second class, however good on its own level, becomes an enemy when it thus assumes demonic pretensions, and erects itself into a quasi-spiritual value. As M. de Rougemont has recently told us, the conjugal eros ceases to be a devil only when it ceases to be a god. My whole contention is that in literature, in addition to the spiritual good and evil which it carries, there is also a good and evil of this second class, a properly cultural or literary good and evil, which must not be allowed to masquerade as good and evil of the first class. And I shall feel really happy about all the minor differences between my critics and me when I find in them some recognition of this danger, some admission that they and I, and all of the like education, are daily tempted to a kind of idolatry. I am not pretending to know how this baffling phenomenon, the two kinds or levels of good and evil, is to be fitted into a consistent philosophy of values, but it is one thing to be unable to explain a phenomenon, another to ignore it. And I admit that all of these lower goods ought to be encouraged, that, as pedagogues, it is our duty to try to make our pupils happy and beautiful, to give them cleanly habits and good taste. And the discharge of that duty is, of course, a good of the first class. I will admit, too, that evils of this second class are often the result and symptom of real spiritual evil. Dirty fingernails, a sluggish liver, boredom, and a bad English style may often, in a given case, result from disobedience, laziness, arrogance, or intemperance. But they may also result from poverty or other misfortune. They may even result from virtue. The man's ears may be unwashed behind, or his English style borrowed from the jargon of the daily press, because he has given to good works the time and energy which others use to acquire elegant habits or good language. Gregory the Great, I believe, vaunted the barbarity of his style. Our Lord ate with unwashed hands. I am stating, not solving, a problem. If my critics want to continue the discussion, I think they can do so most usefully by taking it right away from literature and the arts to some other of these mysterious lower goods, where probably all our minds will work more coolly. I should welcome an essay from Brother Every or Mr. Bethel on conjugal eros, or personal cleanliness. My dilemma about literature is that I admit bad taste to be, in some sense, a bad thing, but do not think it per se evil. My critics will probably say the same of physical dirt. If we could thrash the problem out on the neutral ground of clean and dirty fingers, we might return to the battlefield of literature with new lights. I hope it is now unnecessary to point out that in denying taste to be a spiritual value, I am not for a moment suggesting, as Mr. Bethel thought, May 1940, page 357, that it comes under God's arbitrary condemnation. I enjoyed my breakfast this morning, and I think that was a good thing, and do not think it was condemned by God. But I do not think myself a good man for enjoying it. The distinction does not seem to me a very fine one.
In the vastness of the universe of ideas, philosophical questions are like twinkling stars that illuminate the darkness of the unknown. Amidst this intellectual spectacle, C.S. Lewis's 37 phrases emerge as constellations of insight and inquiry, inviting us to explore the deepest mysteries of human existence. These brief yet impactful words serve as portals to a journey of reflection and discovery. What do these phrases reveal about the nature of truth, morality, and life itself? How do they challenge us to rethink our own conceptions and delve into the depths of human thought? In this analysis, we will unravel the power of these C.S. Lewis phrases and explore the universal truths they reveal. 1. Everything changes, nothing ever stays the same. C.S. Lewis's quote addresses a fascinating and often paradoxical aspect of human experience: the nature of time and our perception of change. The first part of the statement, "Everything changes, nothing remains the same," reflects a fundamental truth in many aspects of life and the universe. From the laws of physics, which show that the universe is in a constant state of change and evolution, to transformations in society, technology, and our personal lives, change is a constant. The second part of the quote, "Isn't it funny how day by day nothing changes, but when you look back everything is different," speaks to how we perceive time and change in the short and long term. In day-to-day life, changes may seem insignificant or imperceptible because we are immersed in our routines, and the small daily variations do not seem to significantly alter the course of our lives. 2. There are far, far better things ahead than the ones you leave behind. This phrase by C.S. Lewis is an invitation to optimism and hope, encouraging us to look to the future with a positive perspective. The central idea is that, regardless of the losses or challenges we face, the future holds possibilities and joys that surpass what has been left behind. This thought can be particularly comforting in times of transition or loss, reminding us that closing one chapter in our lives makes room for the beginning of another, potentially more rewarding and enriching one. Lewis, with this statement, also touches on the transitory nature of life and the importance of not clinging excessively to the past or material things. Excessive attachment to what has been can prevent us from fully embracing new opportunities and experiences. The idea that the best is yet to come serves as a reminder to keep our minds and hearts open to the infinite possibilities the future holds. 3. Nothing in life ours to keep. This idea can be interpreted in various ways. In a material sense, it suggests that generosity and the act of sharing with others can enrich our own life experience, providing a sense of satisfaction and purpose that simple accumulation of material goods cannot offer. On a deeper level, it can be argued that only through generosity and altruism can we truly experience the richness of life, as it is in giving that we receive. Furthermore, Lewis may be touching on a broader spiritual or philosophical truth, where true freedom and fulfillment come from transcending selfishness and excessive attachment to worldly things. By opening ourselves to others and connecting to something greater than ourselves, we can find a sense of possession and belonging that is deeper and more enduring. 4. Give up yourself, and you will find your real self. This concept, often explored in spiritual and philosophical contexts, suggests that the true essence of who we are can only be found when we abandon the ego, superficial desires, and pretensions. Lewis is encouraging us to look beyond the layers of identity constructed by society, expectations, and our own ego. By giving up yourself, he refers to the act of setting aside these superficial layers to discover the true self that resides on a deeper level. This implies a process of detachment from material desires, selfish ambitions, and the relentless pursuit of external approval in order to connect with more authentic and enduring values. 5. Don't doubt your value. Don't run from who you are. Lewis suggests that our existence and essence have immense value simply because we are divine creations, regardless of how we compare ourselves to others or the ideals we may hold. This perspective invites us to recognize and value our own uniqueness and the unique contribution we can offer to the world. Furthermore, by stating, "Don't run from who you are," Lewis is encouraging us to confront and embrace our true nature, with all its imperfections and beauties. He suggests that authenticity and self-acceptance are essential for living a full and meaningful life. This acceptance is not just about recognizing our qualities, but also embracing our flaws and limitations, understanding that they are part of what makes us unique. 6. If you find in yourself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that you were made for another world. Lewis addresses the sensation, often experienced by many, that there is a kind of emptiness or longing within us that worldly joys and satisfactions cannot completely fill. This perception can lead to the conclusion that such insatiable desires point to a reality or existence beyond what is known and experienced in this physical world. The idea that we were made for another world suggests that human existence has a purpose and a meaning that extend beyond everyday life and earthly experiences. This view is rooted in many spiritual and religious traditions, which see life on earth as a journey or preparation for a higher or spiritual reality. 7. You don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. Lewis is challenging the common perception that often prioritizes the physical and material, redefining human identity in a way that places the soul, or the spiritual essence, at the center. By stating that you are a soul, Lewis highlights the primacy and eternal importance of the soul compared to the physical body, which is temporary and transient. This view echoes many religious and philosophical traditions that see the body as a temporary vessel for the soul, which is the true essence of being. The idea that each of you will still be alive after the dissolution of the physical universe speaks to the belief in the continuity of the soul's existence beyond physical death. Lewis suggests that the true essence of who we are transcends the limitations of time and physical space, pointing to a spiritual reality that is eternal and unchanging. 8. Don't shine so others can see you. Shine so that, through you, others can see God. This idea is deeply rooted in the Christian notion of testimony, where an individual's life is seen as a mirror or a beacon that reflects God's light to the world. Instead of seeking personal glory, Lewis suggests that we should aspire to live in such a way that our actions, words, and even our presence allow others to glimpse divinity, goodness, and truth that transcend our individual existence. This perspective shifts the focus from the self to the other, and ultimately to the divine, promoting a way of living that is marked by generosity, service, and authenticity. By shining not for our own enhancement, but to illuminate the path to God, we are called to an existence that values humility and altruism, recognizing that our greatest contribution may be to facilitate others in finding their own connection to the sacred. 9. Hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. Lewis suggests that challenges and adversities are not mere meaningless obstacles, but rather instruments of growth and preparation. Difficulties have the potential to transform us, shaping our character and refining our virtues in ways that prosperity and ease simply cannot. This process of growth through adversity is often what prepares us to take on larger roles and responsibilities, leading us to destinies that far surpass our initial circumstances. By mentioning that God allows these experiences of low points, Lewis is touching on the notion that there is a divine order and purpose behind life's events, even those that seem negative at first glance. The lessons learned through adversity are seen as essential to our spiritual and personal development, teaching us perseverance, compassion, humility, and dependence on a force greater than ourselves. The idea that God does not make anyone wait unless it is good for him to wait reflects a view that God's timing is perfect, even if we do not immediately understand it. Patience and waiting are seen not as emptiness or meaningless inactivity, but as an opportunity for internal growth and preparation for what is to come. Thus, Lewis encourages us to face difficulties and periods of waiting not as abandonments, but as integral parts of a larger plan that leads us to an extraordinary destiny. 10. Experience is the most brutal of teachers. By referring to experience as the most brutal of teachers, Lewis is underscoring the often harsh and unforgiving nature of real life as a vehicle for learning. Unlike theoretical or academic learning, experience educates us through successes, and more often through failures, losses, and challenges. These moments can be painful and difficult to endure, but they are also incredibly potent in forging character, resilience, and wisdom. The second part of the phrase, "but you learn, my God, do you learn," emphasizes the effectiveness of this type of learning. Despite its brutality, or perhaps because of it, the lessons learned through experience tend to be deeply internalized. The direct experience of consequences, whether positive or negative, engraves knowledge in a way that passive instruction rarely achieves. 11. Repeated failures are fingerposts on the road to achievement. In describing failures as fingerposts, Lewis suggests that each failure serves as a lesson and a guide, pointing towards adjustments and changes necessary in our approaches, strategies, or even in our understanding. These posts illuminate the way, offering critical insights that help us navigate the path towards our goals. The idea of failing forward is particularly powerful. It implies that each failure, instead of pushing us backward, actually propels us forward, bringing us closer to success. This is because we learn, adapt, and grow through our experiences of failure. This concept encourages a mindset of resilience and persistence, where obstacles are seen as opportunities for development and improvement. 12. You are never too old to set another goal or to dream a new dream. Lewis challenges the notion that age is a barrier to aspirations, goals, and dreams. He emphasizes the infinite capacity of the human being to reinvent oneself and pursue new directions, regardless of where one stands in their life journey. This idea is an invitation to reject self-imposed limitations and social expectations that often accompany aging. Instead of viewing old age as a time to slow down or give up on new endeavors, Lewis suggests that there is always room for new beginnings and possibilities. This can be particularly inspiring for those who may feel they have missed opportunities or that it is too late to pursue passions or interests that have been set aside. Essentially, Lewis reminds us that the ability to dream and aspire knows no age limits. This message serves as an encouragement to continue seeking growth, fulfillment, and joy in all stages of our lives, embracing the ongoing journey of discovery and renewal. 13. Don't let your happiness depend on something you may lose. This brings forth a profound reflection on the nature of happiness and the importance of grounding it in aspects of life that are enduring and intrinsic, rather than external and transient. This idea encourages us to reconsider the sources of our joy and satisfaction, warning against basing our happiness on elements that are outside of our control and can easily be altered or lost, such as material possessions, social status, or even specific relationships. By highlighting the volatility of many of the things we value, Lewis suggests the pursuit of a more authentic and resilient happiness, one that is not shaken by the inevitable changes and challenges of life. This may involve cultivating internal virtues such as peace of mind, gratitude, self-love, and spirituality, which are less susceptible to external circumstances. 14. This world is a great sculptor's shop. It is a rich metaphor reflecting on the process of personal growth and transformation within the context of human existence. Comparing the world to a sculptor's workshop, Lewis suggests that life experiences, with their challenges and opportunities, act as the tools and techniques used by a sculptor to shape and define their creations. In this analogy, we humans are like unfinished statues, constantly being formed and refined by the hands of the sculptor, a metaphor for life's forces, circumstances, interactions with other people, and possibly a divine influence or destiny. Each experience carves our character, molds our values, and affects our life trajectory, contributing to the ongoing process of becoming who we are meant to be. The rumor that some statues will come to life can be interpreted as an allusion to the idea of reaching a state of awakening or spiritual enlightenment, where one becomes fully aware of their purpose, their essential nature, and their connection to something greater than themselves. This can also be seen as a moment of personal fulfillment, where a person transcends previous limitations and emerges more alive, authentic, and fully realized. 15. We are mirrors whose brightness, if we are bright, is wholly derived from the sun that shines upon us. Comparing ourselves to mirrors suggests that our value and brightness are not inherent, but reflected from a larger external source, in this case, symbolized by the sun. This source can be interpreted in various ways, including love, truth, beauty, or in a spiritual context, the divine. The idea that our brightness is wholly derived from this external source reminds us of our dependence and connection to something beyond ourselves to find meaning, purpose, and light in our lives. The second part of Lewis's reflection about the importance of keeping the self clean and bright to have a clear view of God reinforces the idea that our ability to perceive and reflect truth and beauty is affected by the state of our inner being. Just as the view of the moon can be obscured by a dirty telescope, our perception of the divine or the deeper meaning of life can be clouded by our faults, biases, or spiritual neglect. 16. There are two kinds of people, those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." Lewis delineates a fundamental division between those who choose to submit to divine will and those who insist on following their own path, regardless of divine guidance. By saying, "Thy will be done," an individual expresses a willingness to align with God's purposes and plans, placing God's wisdom and authority above their own preferences and desires. This voluntary submission is seen as an act of faith and trust in God's goodness and sovereignty. On the other hand, when God says, "Thy will be done" to an individual, Lewis suggests that God grants that person the freedom to choose their own path, even if that path leads to separation from God. This is an expression of divine justice and respect for human freedom, allowing the natural consequences of a person's choices to unfold. 17. C.S. Lewis's reflection. I have no duty to be anyone's friend, and no man in the world has a duty to be mine. No claims, no shadow of necessity. Friendship is unnecessary, like philosophy, like art, like the universe itself, for God did not need to create. It has no survival value. Rather, it is one of those things which give value to survival, addresses the nature and value of friendship in a deeply contemplative manner. Lewis is highlighting that friendship, unlike basic needs such as food and shelter, is not essential for our physical survival. However, he argues that it is precisely this unnecessariness that elevates friendship, philosophy, art, and the universe to something that transcends mere functionality or utility. Friendship is valued not for its usefulness, but for its ability to enrich the human experience, adding a layer of meaning, joy, and depth to life that goes beyond mere survival. By stating that there is no duty in friendship, Lewis also suggests that true relationships should not be based on obligations or expectations, but rather on a free and mutual choice to share life, thoughts, and moments. This underscores authenticity and voluntariness as essential aspects of meaningful friendships. The comparison with God's creation of the universe serves to illustrate the idea that the intrinsic value of something may lie in its beauty, complexity, and ability to inspire, rather than in its functional necessity. Thus, Lewis leads us to appreciate friendship and, by extension, art, philosophy, and the universe as gifts that enrich our existence, making life not only bearable but deeply valuable. 18. You will never make a good impression on other people until you stop thinking about what sort of impression you are making. Lewis suggests that conscious effort to shape how we are seen often has the opposite effect, leading to a perception of inauthenticity or excessive effort. This reflection encourages us to adopt a more genuine and less calculated approach in social interactions. When concern about the impression we are making is replaced by authenticity and being present in the moment, we are more likely to truly connect with others. This is because authenticity promotes an openness and vulnerability that are essential for meaningful human relationships. Additionally, excessive concern about image can distract us from listening and engaging meaningfully with others, as we are more focused on how we are being perceived than on the interaction itself. By releasing the need to control others' perception, we make space to be ourselves, which is often more attractive and impressive than any carefully constructed persona. 19. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Lewis highlights that the act of loving inherently involves the risk of pain and loss because opening the heart to others, whether to people, animals, or even passions, exposes us to the possibility of being hurt. However, he argues that the only way to completely avoid this pain, by isolating oneself and protecting the heart from any emotional involvement, comes at a much higher cost. By doing so, the heart, while safe from pain, also becomes isolated from any form of true love and consequently from one of the most enriching experiences of human life. The paradox presented by Lewis is that in attempting to shield the heart from any harm by making it unbreakable and impenetrable, we actually render it unredeemable. This suggests that a heart never exposed to the risk of love loses its ability to love and be loved, becoming hardened and insensitive. 20. What draws people to be friends is that they see the same truth. Highlights the importance of intellectual and spiritual connections in forming deep and meaningful friendships. Lewis suggests that at the core of true friendships, there is a mutual recognition and appreciation of certain values, ideas, or fundamental truths that transcend superficial circumstances or passing interests. This view underscores that friendships are not merely based on convenience, physical attraction, or social circumstances, but on a deeper connection that involves the discovery and acknowledgement of a shared truth. This truth can refer to a common understanding of life, moral principles, a shared passion for certain subjects, or even a similar worldview. The act of sharing this truth implies not only recognizing it, but also experiencing and exploring it together, which can provide a solid foundation for the development of a lasting friendship. Friendships rooted in this kind of mutual understanding tend to be more resilient and enriching, as they are based on the mutual appreciation of aspects of being that are considered significant and valuable. 21. Love is a steady wish for the loved person's ultimate good. Lewis redefines love beyond the common notion of intense emotion or physical attraction. He presents love as an active and deliberate commitment to the well-being and happiness of the other person, regardless of circumstances or one's own emotions. This conception of love as a steady wish emphasizes the volitional and intentional nature of true love. It is not seen as something passive or merely sentimental, but as a continuous choice to prioritize the good of the loved one. This implies a commitment to actions and decisions that promote the well-being and fulfillment of that person, even if it requires sacrifice or selflessness. By qualifying the supreme good so far as it can be attained, Lewis also acknowledges the reality of human limitations and life circumstances. He suggests that while love aspires to the ideal of the highest good for the loved one must act within practical possibilities and the limitations of the real world. 22. Do not waste time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did, and you will. Explores a pragmatic and action-oriented approach to loving one's neighbor, a central idea in many ethical and religious traditions. Lewis suggests that instead of being paralyzed by internal analysis of our feelings or doubt about our ability to love others, we should simply start acting as if we love them. This principle reflects the idea that love can be both an action and a feeling, and that by choosing to act lovingly, regardless of our momentary feelings, we can cultivate genuine feelings of love over time. 23. No man knows how bad he is till he has tried very hard to be good. Addresses the complexity of human nature and the discovery of personal character through the effort to live according to high ethical or moral standards. Lewis suggests that it is in the process of striving to act rightly and do good that we often come face to face with our own failures, limitations, and negative tendencies. This reflection implies that understanding our own imperfections and the ability to recognize our faults are amplified when we put ourselves to the test, seeking to live virtuously. This can be a humbling experience as we discover that goodness and virtue are not as easily achieved as we might have imagined, thus revealing the depth and persistence of our flaws and weaknesses. 24. In God there is no hunger that needs to be filled, only plenteousness that desires to give, reflects a profound theological view on the nature of God and the relationship between the divine and humanity. Lewis suggests that God, being a being of fullness and perfection, has no needs or lacks. Instead, he is an infinite source of generosity and giving. This idea contrasts the conception of God with human nature, which is often driven by needs, desires, and a constant search for satisfaction. Instead, God is portrayed as someone whose essence is fullness, needing nothing from us to complete or improve his being. Therefore, God's desire to relate to humanity and provide for his creations is not motivated by a lack or need, but by an expansive and generous love that seeks to share his own fullness. 25. If a person thinks she is not conceited, she is very conceited indeed. Addresses the paradoxical nature of self-perception, especially regarding pride and vanity. Lewis suggests that excessive self-assurance in one's humility can ironically be a sign of deep pride. The act of considering oneself free from vanity can be in itself a manifestation of vanity, as it implies satisfaction with one's supposed moral superiority or self-control. This observation points to the complexity of human nature and the difficulty of achieving true humility, which is not based on denial of one's own faults, but on sincere recognition of them. True humility involves honest self-assessment and a willingness to accept that, as human beings, we are all fallible and susceptible to error and pride. 26. Pride is spiritual cancer. C.S. Lewis's view of pride as a spiritual cancer highlights the destructive nature of this vice in a person's spiritual and relational life. By describing pride in this way, Lewis suggests that it corrupts and consumes the ability to love, find satisfaction, and even exercise good judgment. Pride is presented not just as a minor character flaw, but as a corrosive force that can destroy the most fundamental aspects of human and spiritual well-being. The second quote expands on this idea, explaining how pride obstructs knowledge of God. Lewis illustrates this with the image of a proud person who is always looking down, both literally and metaphorically, judging others and circumstances from a position of supposed superiority. This posture of looking down symbolizes a self-imposed barrier that blocks sight and openness to higher realities, including the spiritual. Therefore, as long as one is stuck in this attitude of pride, they will be unable to perceive or connect with God, who is above in the spiritual sense. Both quotes emphasize the idea that pride not only negatively affects interpersonal relationships and self-image, but also constitutes a significant obstacle to spiritual growth and perception of realities beyond the self. Lewis invites us to recognize pride as a serious impediment to love, genuine happiness, and wisdom, encouraging a constant pursuit of humility as a path to spiritual health and true knowledge. 27. Only the pure in heart want to see God. This quote distills a profound truth about the nature of spiritual longing and the necessary condition for genuine seeking of God. Lewis suggests that purity of heart is not only a quality that makes someone fit to encounter God, but also the very characteristic that awakens the desire to seek Him. Purity of heart can be understood as a cleansing of intentions, an absence of falsehood or duplicity, and a sincerity in the pursuit of truth and good. This purity involves an orientation of the being toward what is genuine and good, free from the distortions of selfishness, pride, and disordered passions that can obscure spiritual vision and deflect the quest for truth. By stating that only the pure in heart desire to see God, Lewis is highlighting the idea that the desire to know and draw near to the divine requires a certain inner disposition characterized by purity and sincerity. This implies that the spiritual journey toward God begins with an inner work of purification and alignment of the desires of the heart with spiritual values. 28. Human history is the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. C.S. Lewis's statements about human pursuit of happiness outside of God reflect a deep critique of the nature of human aspirations and endeavors throughout history. Lewis suggests that the relentless quest for satisfaction in earthly things, whether wealth, power, pleasure, or status, is futile, as true happiness and peace cannot be found apart from God. God cannot give us a happiness and peace apart from Himself, because it is not there. This assertion highlights the view that any attempt to find lasting contentment outside of a relationship with the divine is doomed to failure, as the true source of peace and joy resides in God. To what will you look for help if you will not look to that which is stronger than yourself? This rhetorical question invites reflection on the need to seek support and guidance in a force greater than our own limited human capacity, suggesting that reliance on purely human resources or solutions is insufficient to address life's fundamental challenges. All that we call human history, money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empires, slavery, is the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. This observation about human history as a series of failed attempts to find satisfaction in earthly substitutes for God underscores the view that many human endeavors and conflicts stem from a misguided search for meaning and contentment. Together, these reflections by Lewis challenge us to reconsider the sources in which we seek happiness and purpose, encouraging a reorientation toward spiritual values and a deeper relationship with the divine as the path to true satisfaction and peace. 29. Forgiving does not mean excusing. This quote distinguishes two fundamental attitudes toward dealing with offenses or mistakes. By stating that forgiveness does not equate to excuse, Lewis highlights the importance of acknowledging the seriousness and reality of an offense without allowing it to perpetuate resentment or hostility. Forgiveness implies a conscious decision to release resentment or the desire for retaliation against someone who has wronged us, even when we recognize that the act committed against us was wrong and unjustifiable. This distinction is crucial because it recognizes the responsibility of the offender without allowing that offense to dominate future relationships or the emotional state of the offended party. In contrast, excusing someone often involves minimizing the offense or justifying the offender's behavior, potentially ignoring the harm caused. Thus, excusing can inadvertently enable or validate harmful behavior. Lewis suggests that forgiveness is a deeper act that requires considerable moral strength. It involves choosing to respond to wrongdoing with a kind of mercy that does not deny the injustice of the act, but chooses not to define oneself or be consummated by it. This approach to forgiveness allows for healing and reconciliation while maintaining moral integrity by acknowledging the gravity of the wrong. Therefore, a forgiveness, as Lewis conceives it, is an act of grace that transcends mere acceptance of others' faults, promoting the restoration of relationships without denying the reality of the harm caused. 30. Thirst was made for water, inquiry for truth. By C.S. Lewis offers a powerful metaphor that underscores the intrinsic connection between human pursuit of knowledge and the nature of truth. By comparing physical thirst for water with the innate desire to understand truth, Lewis invites us to reflect on the fundamental need we have to seek knowledge and understanding. Just as thirst is a natural condition that drives us to seek water to quench it and ensure our physical survival and well-being, curiosity and the desire to understand are fundamental impulses that lead us to seek truth, to satisfy our need for intellectual and spiritual knowledge and understanding. This comparison emphasizes that just as water is essential for physical life, truth is indispensable for our intellectual and spiritual life. Just as our bodies are designed to seek and consume water to maintain their health and proper functioning, our minds are naturally inclined to question, explore, and seek understanding to grow and thrive intellectually. 31. Faith is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted, in spite of your changing moods. This phrase by C.S. Lewis offers a profound understanding of faith that transcends mere emotional or irrational belief. Lewis suggests that true faith involves a continuous commitment to convictions and truths that have been accepted by reason, even when emotions or circumstances may try to sway us. This conception of faith highlights its active and deliberate nature, not as a passive state of acceptance, but as a constant exercise of will and discipline. By defining faith as the art of staying firm, Lewis implies that it requires practice, skill, and conscious effort to sustain beliefs in the face of doubt, fear, or uncertainty that may arise with fluctuations in our emotional states or changes in life circumstances. By emphasizing that faith is based on things reason once accepted, Lewis is also rejecting the notion that faith and reason are mutually exclusive. Instead, he proposes that authentic faith has its roots in rational and conscious understanding, and that maintaining this faith requires a continuous and deliberate return to these rational principles, especially when challenged by ever-changing moods. 32. We meet no ordinary people in our lives. This statement by C.S. Lewis offers a deeply human perspective on the nature of interpersonal interactions and the uniqueness of each individual. Lewis suggests that every human encounter, no matter how brief or trivial it may seem, is an opportunity to connect with someone extraordinary, whose life, experiences, and perspectives are unique and valuable. This assertion challenges the notion that some people are common or ordinary, highlighting that all individuals have a story, an inner complexity, and a unique potential that make them worthy of attention and respect. Even those who may seem to play mundane roles in our lives can have unexplored depths and inner riches that deserve to be recognized and valued. 33. Everyone thinks forgiveness is a lovely idea until he has something to forgive. This quote addresses the challenging nature of forgiveness and how our perspective on it can change when we find ourselves in the position of needing to forgive someone for a transgression or injustice. Initially, many people may agree that forgiveness is a noble and desirable virtue, recognizing its moral value and the emotional benefits it can bring to both the aggressor and the offended party. However, when confronted with the reality of a situation where they have been hurt or harmed by someone else, the act of forgiveness can become much more difficult than they imagined. This quote highlights the human tendency to idealize forgiveness when we are not directly involved in situations of conflict or hurt. However, when we are faced with the real need to forgive someone who has hurt us, we may discover that forgiveness is a complex and painful process that challenges our emotions, self-image, and values. 34. Integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. This quote highlights the importance of acting in accordance with our values and principles, regardless of the presence of supervision or the potential for reward or punishment. By defining integrity as doing the right thing, Lewis suggests that true integrity goes beyond simply following rules or social norms. It is a matter of moral and ethical principles. This implies making choices based on what is morally correct, even if it is easier or more advantageous to act otherwise. The part of the phrase that emphasizes that this should be done even when no one is watching underscores the importance of authenticity and consistency in our actions. This means that integrity is not something we display only to impress others or avoid negative consequences. It is a quality that is inherently valuable and shapes our conduct in all aspects of life. 35. Children are not a distraction from more important work. They are the most important work. This quote emphasizes the priority and significance of caring for and raising children in a person's life. In doing so, Lewis highlights the responsibility and privilege that parents have to shape and influence the development and future of their children. This statement challenges the common notion that caring for children is merely a secondary part or an obligation that competes with other activities considered more important or meaningful. Instead, Lewis argues that children are not a distraction, but rather the central focus and primary responsibility of any adult who takes on the role of a father or mother. By recognizing children as the most important work, Lewis underscores the profound influence that parents have on the lives and development of their children. He suggests that parental care extends beyond simply providing material needs. It involves nurturing, educating, guiding, and loving children, preparing them to face life's challenges and become responsible and compassionate adults. 36. A children's story that can only be enjoyed by children is not a good children's story. Lewis argues that a story intended for children should be able to captivate and enchant not only the child audience, but also adults, regardless of their age. This statement suggests that the best children's stories transcend age limitations and have a universal appeal that resonates with readers of all ages. They should contain elements such as imagination, adventure, wisdom, and emotion, which can be appreciated and valued by people of all ages, from the youngest children to the oldest adults. By emphasizing that a good children's story should be able to attract a broader audience, Lewis acknowledges the importance of the power of narrative to educate, inspire, and entertain people of all ages. He suggests that, even as we grow and mature, we never lose our love for the magic of enchanting stories, and that we should continue to seek out that magic throughout our lives. 37. True humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. By stating that true humility is not thinking less of yourself, Lewis highlights that self-esteem and recognizing one's own worth are not incompatible with humility. On the contrary, genuine humility involves a balanced view of oneself, free from arrogance or pride, but also free from self-deprecation or underestimation. The second part of the phrase, "it's thinking of yourself less," points to the essence of true humility. It suggests that genuine humility is characterized by a shift of focus from the ego and one's own needs to the needs and interests of others. This implies a spirit of service, compassion, and consideration for others, where the self is not at the center of attention, but rather concern for the well-being and happiness of others. This quote challenges the common notion that humility is linked to self-denial or lack of self-esteem. Instead, Lewis argues that true humility is rooted in a balanced view of oneself, combined with a sincere willingness to put others first. As 37 quotes by C.S. Lewis offer a rich and multifaceted tapestry of wisdom and insight into various aspects of human life, faith, morality, and the human condition. Together, these quotations form a comprehensive panorama that invites deep reflection and personal introspection. A conclusion we can draw from these quotes is the importance of seeking truth, authenticity, and integrity in our lives. Lewis reminds us that true wisdom lies in the ability to look beyond superficial appearances and delve into the essence of things, cultivating a deeper understanding of the world and ourselves. Moreover, the quotes highlight the importance of empathy, compassion, and love for others, as well as the need to cultivate virtues such as humility, forgiveness, and gratitude in our daily lives. They challenge us to grow, to learn, and to evolve as individuals, constantly striving for moral and spiritual excellence. Another recurring theme in these quotes is the idea that true happiness and fulfillment are not found in material achievements or external successes, but rather in connection with the divine, in cultivating meaningful relationships and in serving others. Ultimately, C.S. Lewis's words remind us that the journey of life is a continuous search for meaning, purpose, and transcendence. They encourage us to embrace the challenges, to embrace the journey of life with courage and determination, and to constantly seek truth, goodness, and beauty in the world around us. Around us. Around us. Around us. Around us. Around us.